starting our fifth, and I just wanted to get a pulse from you all as to how you're doing, because the first class was important for me to see how this work is impacting you. Not this course, but just how we're doing DEI on a day-to-day. Okay. So, burnout is a real thing. We can see it here. It's sometimes challenging when one or two or three people talk about it, but when you see it like this, you can see that a lot of people continue to be impacted by that. And I want to continue to hold space for you as we do this work and remind you that, burnout is something we really need to address as a community. Okay, so the first four classes that we did, I wanted to tell you about a framework that I have. It's called the 3 A's. I created it. It stands for, the first A is awareness, the second A is accountability, and the third A is action. Another way to think of it is the first part is using your hearts, right? You're building your awareness. The second piece is using your heads, so how we can apply this within our scope of influence. And then the last one is using our hands, so moving this to action. And you've completed the first piece. So we're going to start going into accountability and how we can think about our roles in this work and what we can do with that. I wanted to say that for those of you that have turned in assignments and I've been reading it, great job. I really want to applaud your shift from moving from just abstract ideas to getting more specific. So, putting timelines on every quarter, every month, every year. This is a budget that we allocate and review on an annual basis. The more specific we are, the more we're building systems. And that's where this work really lies. We want to take out the individual, and we want an individual subjectivity, and we want to create a system where people feel protected from organizational biases. I also want to draw attention to how we want to talk about class a little bit more. I thank you for the person who shared the article about one of the forgotten areas of dimensions of diversity, and that's socioeconomic class. That's very closely tied to other areas. One often is influenced by the other, as in who's been marginalized or underserved in society, and how that can affect our access to resources. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And last class, we made a shift from the term marginalized to underserved. So let's continue to do that in our language. Finally, wanted to wish those of you who are observing Ramadan, a blessed Ramadan. World Autism Awareness Day is around this time, and then we just passed International Transgender Day of Visibility. So these are good areas to remember that different communities are looking for recognition, and we want to continue to be as inclusive as possible when it comes to different communities. So today, I think we can think of this as an extension of last class. And it's really important because as I was reading some of your assignments, I saw the word mentorship come up a lot. And I think once you learn about sponsorship, and I know a lot of you already know about it, but once you learn more about it, I don't think you'll go back. So I think this is going to be a really interesting class for those of you who want to learn more about what sponsorship is. So I actually had a slide in here. It's hidden right now, but it was with me again, because for those of you who missed the first class, just a reintroduction. My name's Dia. I go by she, her pronouns. And, I think it's important when we do this work to also bring ourselves into it. Thank you for those of you who've been sharing your skill set in the Discord channel. We are a community. We can't do this work by ourselves. The more we lean into one another and we share opportunities to, come in and talk to our organizations or do work at our organizations, the more we can make a collective impact. So these are our DEI values. Again, this is the foundation setting that we go through as we do this work. Our house rules, which you're familiar with by now, and our house questions, which is who is in the conversation, how can we be more inclusive, and who is not in the conversation. Sadia, thank you. Also, Sexual Awareness, Assault Awareness Month. Yes, In some states, I know here in Washington, we have a Denim Day declaration for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it goes back to an incident where, please read up about it, where denim comes in and what that means for people who are observing Sexual Assault Awareness Month. But there are ways to observe these months that are not just limited to sharing resources. It could be wearing a certain color or drawing more attention to conversation on our social media channels or even in our workplaces. And thank you, it's Child Abuse Awareness Month. This is something I didn't know, so I definitely want to add this to the global diversity calendar that I've been building, and I appreciate you sharing in the chat. Okay. So this is what we've been doing in all of our classes. I've been pulling on the best practices that we've been sharing in our from our breakout rooms and then putting them in 5 categories. I know we have 10 groups, but I really try to pull out the ones that are systems based. How can we be more inclusive? Best practices from class 4. I need to correct that typo. Number 1, providing services in different languages and times. So the question we had in our last breakout room was how to create access for people from underserved communities. And this is a great systems way of thinking, where it's not just an ad hoc thing, like we are intentional about providing services in different languages, times, access points, so not everybody has to learn the same way. Remembering some people are neurodivergent, so we want to offer enough resources in different ways that not everybody's limited to learning in one way. Offer flexibility to enhance productivity. So some of the suggestions we had come up from you all were on and off camera policy. I still hear people say, you have to turn your camera on. No. I think that it's effective in some cases, but the requirement that this is it is not always inclusive, because it gives us a window into each other's homes and private lives, and not everybody is there, right? And when we switch from day to day, as we looked at our earlier poll, as it depends on, our burnout depending on the day. So hybrid policies are very effective in offering flexibility to enhance productivity. The third best practice, creating inclusive holiday and bereavement policies. So one of the suggestions that came up is different people celebrate holidays differently. Eid is going to be coming up at the end of Ramadan, but also extending this to bereavement policies, right? Not all of us go through bereavement or loss over a period of 3 days. Some of us have different practices that extend beyond that. So building that into our system. Measure input, what we put in, and output, what we put out, metrics. This is a really important one. Often when we do DEI work, we're expected to deliver metrics, but I encourage you to not limit your metrics to just what comes out of something. We are doing long-term building, community building, working with people, and so we're not going to see the immediate results of our work. But what we can do is show metrics around what we put in. That could be the number of people that have joined your DEI committee, how much your employee resource group has grown, how much, how many trainings a consultant has done or coachings a consultant has done. These are all examples of showing impact. And finally, baking inclusive leadership into performance, into promotional reviews. This is one that I'm seeing take off explosively right now, where how a leader shows up is not just, great, good job. Let's actually mark them on it in their promotional reviews and their compensation salary bands. Okay. So our class agenda today, we're going to talk about mentorship versus sponsorship, reverse mentorship, multiple mentorship, and then how to develop these programs and how to pitch them to stakeholders. But we're going to do like a fun little icebreaker, because all of our icebreakers have had to do with our content so far. So I'd love for you to drop into the chat your, what is one thing that you noticed about it being spring this time of year? So, something that just lightens the conversation a little bit. Is there something that comes to mind around this time of year? Robins. My My allergies. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh about that one, but yes, we all definitely are impacted differently. Yeah, it's important to connect with what's happening, in our world, how we're feeling, connecting with our senses. So I appreciate you sharing. Faith, I missed that, but I saw a laugh out loud, so clearly somebody's responding to what you shared. Black folks out on the stoop. More light. Yes, it's interesting how it looks different from coast to coast as well. Okay, so as we are seeing that content dropped in, I just want to tell you about the workshop that we'll be doing later on. The case study we have is Ernst & Young, and Ernst & Young has been recognized as an organization who has developed sponsorship programs, including one called the Inclusive Leadership Program, and it pairs high potential performers with executive board members. And when we get to the stage of the breakout room, I'm going to ask you to come up with one way to pitch a mentorship or sponsorship program to leadership. Because I continue to see these questions come up in our office hours, which is, how do we convince leadership of this? So this is going to be your opportunity to really put this into practice. We're going to come back and share it. And again, we're going to come up with a list of best practices. Okay. So land acknowledgement, I stand on the traditional land of the Salish people and Duwamish people. I want to ask you how we can make an acknowledgement like this global, right? When we talk about Indigenous land acknowledgement, this resource is looking at land acknowledgements in the occupied land of Canada and the US. How can we look and include Indigenous people in our conversations globally? Australia has a lot of Aboriginal folks that we also want to connect with. So we want to take this conversation about Indigenous inclusivity global. Okay, so a quick review of last class, and I'm actually going to drop in a poll as to which part resonated with you. So as you're filling that in, I will give you a minute and then I'll give you a brief review of what we talked about. All right, equity before meritocracy, but all seem to have some interest. What would be interesting to me as a DEI practitioner is who found the savior complex interesting. I'm not going to ask, but I'm just saying that from a data lens, I often think, okay, maybe people who are underserved may find the savior complex concept more interesting because it's not something we often talk about than others. So you can see here how the polls may show us something, but it's not always showing us the complete picture unless we get a breakdown by identity. So last class, in brief, on the surface, it may appear that certain people are in the positions that they're in because they've worked hard, and adversely, those who are not in positions of success are there because they haven't worked hard. And as we know, this is a narrative that's easy to buy into because it's simple, but the reality is a lot more complicated. So hopefully we got into that a little bit more. The solution is not the savior complex. The solution is not to swoop in and create solutions for underserved communities. The solution is access and exposure, which we're going to talk about today. An example of that is the mentorship and sponsorship model. And that's why I consider today's lesson to be an extension of last week's lesson. So here we are. Okay, mentorship and sponsorship. I am going to share two polls with you. One of them is asking you about if you have a mentor, and one of them is asking you if you have a sponsor. But first, I wanted to say that in my experience as a brown woman coming from the tech space, there's a lot of focus on career advice, but not a lot of focus on career access. And that's why I'm so passionate and so focused on mentorship and sponsorship. So let's get these polls from you, and it's this one and then one more, and then we're done for the polls. So the question here is, do you have a mentor? And I tried to give a number of different options here so that you're not limited to one. So here are our results. A lot of you have mentors, and if we had more time, and perhaps we can talk about this in the breakout room, but I'm very curious how that has impacted your careers. And, you know, for those who would like one, I'm very interested in what the challenges are in you finding a mentor, because that's probably one of the hardest things, is figuring out how to find a mentor for yourself or for people within your organization. So the second question, which is a two-parter to this, is, do you have a sponsor? Okay, and you can see here one of my options is I don't know what a sponsor is, and that's completely fine. We will go into that. Okay, so a lot of people say yes, but more people say no. And again, we have a group that says I'd like one. And lastly, I don't know what a sponsor is. But what we're seeing is 44 people, nobody said they wouldn't like one. So again, we ourselves know the value of a sponsor. So let's break this down. Okay. Mentorship is where somebody advises you and helps you plan your career. Mentorship can happen through structured or unstructured meetings where the mentor, which is the person giving the advice, and the mentee, which is the person receiving advice, often discuss problems and solutions. Sponsorship is where somebody advocates for you and helps you advance your career. So again, mentorship is advice and sponsorship is access. Sponsorship can happen through forwarding jobs, suggesting stretch projects, and advocating for your promotion with decision makers. So it's somebody using their privilege. So if we go back to our first class, we talked about the wheel of power and privilege. We talked about how privilege is not a switch, it's a spectrum. We all hold some degree to that. So using that privilege, this is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways you can use your privilege within an organization to make impactful change. What I have here is two boxes, but some people like to even draw a Venn diagram where you have two circles and then there's a section there that's overlapped to say mentorship offers this, and you have some examples, you know, building confidence, providing tips and strategies, and sponsorship is, you know, supporting the risk taking, connecting proteges to career opportunities, and in the middle is that piece that both of them support careers, right? So some people would say yes to sponsorship, no to mentorship. As somebody who's received both, I personally think they're both beneficial, and for different reasons. An example is if somebody's returning to the workplace, let's say they're a parent, or they may not know how things have changed, right? So what they need is somebody to help them feel comfortable in the workplace again. And that's something a mentor can do, help them navigate the unwritten rules. And then there's somebody who perhaps is doing everything right and they don't need the advice. They just need somebody to advocate for them because they don't have access to those tables or places of influence. So again, the point here is that we need organizational conversations about building policies and practices that create access. So to break it down for you further, oh, and sorry, I wanted to ask if I could get a show of hands. Are there any coaches in our group? Luz, I see your hand. Monica, Fatima, Jen. Okay, great. This is the other piece. We have mentors, we have sponsors, Amanda, so we have quite a few, and please take note of this as a class. There's some amazing resources within our own class. But another way to look at this is we have mentors, we have sponsors, and then we have coaches, right? Coaches offer up another added element to this. And collectively, imagine the impact if we could have all three, right? So I don't want to overlook coaches at all. In fact, I want to place a particular importance on the value that coaches bring to career success. Okay, so this next slide over here is a visual. It's a helpful way to think about the differences. You have here this person who's saying, offering mentorship. Have you tried applying to speak at conferences? And then sponsorship is I recommended you for the speaking gig, right? So you can see the difference where somebody is actually advocating for you as opposed to just giving you advice. And then I've written here that mentorship provides advice, which underserved communities sometimes need, and sponsorship provides access, which underserved communities always need. That's what makes them underserved. They haven't gotten that access already. So here's 3 images, and again, if you have that toolkit folder on your desktop, I would recommend, screenshotting these, saving these. It's by bleaderly.com, but there's 3 different images here, very powerful, easy to remember. Mentors talk with you, sponsors talk about you. Mentors give you perspective, sponsors give you opportunities. Mentors help you skill up, and sponsors help you move up. So you can see, the similarity that we're beginning to see between mentors and sponsors. One in real life practice is use the language change, right? You may have seen if I have added feedback to some of the assignments you've given. If you've written down the word mentorship, I've put a /sponsorship word next to it. So the more intentionally we use these words in our organizations, the more we start to create a shift in thinking among our leaders, where they no longer want to provide advice, they want to provide opportunities. And another in real life practice is having a formal system where people sign up, right? These ideas are great on paper, but what are we actually going to do with it? So start thinking within your organizations, whether they're small, medium, large, nonprofit, profit, how would you create a system where somebody can sign up and be paired with somebody, so that we're not just giving the opportunity to people who ask for it, right? We want to extend that opportunity to everybody. Okay, so this is a quote I've heard many times. I'm saying various women because it's been shared on many reports about the state of women in corporate America, but it extends way beyond that. And it is, we are over-mentored and under-sponsored. And I'm sure some of us can relate to that when you hear these words, that there's definitely, an overemphasis in our society and in our workplaces on being mentored, but we don't talk enough and we don't put enough resources, action, and backup, buy-in behind sponsorship. Sorry. Okay, this is another piece that I wanted to share with you, and this is about reverse mentorship. I have been talking about reverse mentorship for a really long time. My mentor is a wonderful woman in the Canadian government, Senator Ratna Omidvar. I don't know if you know her, but I would highly advise you look her up. She's an independent senator, and she's been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for 40 plus years. And she comes from the school of thought that, as a former immigrant and refugee, we can learn from each other and we should be learning from each other. And so I've really embraced this idea that reverse mentorship is a relationship where the benefits flow both ways. Some examples are seniors learn from juniors, cisgender learn from transgender, Americans learn from non-Americans. And even reading the word non-Americans there, I don't think that's quite inclusive, because I'm using a word that's in relation to Americans. But what I mean to say is Americans learn from the global majority. So I will make a language change there. This is just a simplified image, but there's so much more that comes out of reverse mentorship. I just signed up with a coach, a man named Paul Mack, who lives in Toronto. He is new to the coaching space. He's also a man who's visually impaired. And I think that, I really want to learn from that skill set. So it's something that we need to be intentional about, is saying, oh, I can sit here in front of this class and I can teach you, but I also want to learn from all of you in return. It's very empowering to be in a position to share your expertise with others. So it's not just an exchange of skills, it's a practice in learning how to be a mentor and sponsor, and not just be on the receiving end of mentorship and sponsorship. So, Jen, I see your hand up. Do you, let me just check where we are. Yeah, did you want to ask your question quickly?
Yeah, the part about cisgender learn from transgender, I'll be transparent that it seems kind of violent because like transgender folks shouldn't be teaching shit, right? Like we're talking about these identities that are so marginalized that they shouldn't be teaching anything. And I think if we're talking about juniors learning from seniors and vice versa, there's a different power dynamic than cisgender people learning from transgender folks. And I think that if we think of that way, we're putting marginalized people to teach on this identity that cisgender people should be learning on themselves, right? I think there's a difference of a trans advocate who's like, I want to teach you about this thing because you're paying me, versus a transgender person who's like, I am teaching you so I don't get murdered or I get fired. Like, I think there's a different power dynamic when we talk about those two things. American from folks that aren't American, yeah, but I think the trans, especially with the violent, harmful trans policy going right now, trans folks shouldn't be teaching shit. Like, I just kind of challenge on that one, and maybe to rethink like what identities are we placing potentially in harmful spaces if we're expecting them to teach people without being paid.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I've written that down, and I have thoughts, but I want to sit with that because I think that that's a really important point, is, are we just putting one group in a position of expecting them to teach a dominant group at the expense of, their own safety? So I appreciate this challenge, and I think it's something to definitely sit with, and I encourage others to sit with this too. So thank you, Jen, for sharing that. Okay, in the chat, I see, what was the name of the senator? Okay, so let's sit with what Jen said. I think that's a really important point, that in giving these examples, it's not just one teaching at the harm of themselves. We want to actually put the onus on people to educate themselves on issues that are impacting transgender folk. I think where we can do this is an exchange of experiences. So maybe we need to change the word teach to an exchange of experiences through active listening. I think that's something that's a little bit safer. But again, let's sit with that before we decide who should be included in this dynamic. Shanta, I see your hand up as well, and I just want to get through a couple more slides, and I will definitely come to you before our breakout room. So if you're okay with that, I want to make sure that we give you the time to ask your question or make your statement as well.
Sure. I just had a question about that last slide, so I'll write it down.
Sure. Thank you. So multiple mentorship is the idea that we don't get all of our support from one person. So coming back to that diversity iceberg, to those of you who are part of our first class, think about the groups or the identities that you don't probably have in your personal network or your professional network. I have a friend who is living in London right now, and I told her I want a mentor or sponsor who's underserved, a woman of color, and she said, oh, I would actually challenge that and think about how you can benefit from mentorship or sponsorship from somebody who's a white man. And I said, why? And she says, well, they have access to places that you don't have access to. So I think that there's a strength in mapping out something similar to this, where, this is a resource that's been provided from the Harvard Business Review, and it's called Craft Your Mentor Map. And it's the idea that depending on the support you're looking for, these are the names of the people that can provide you with that. There is strength in not relying on one person. We know that in our life too, right? Different people play different roles, including ourselves. So this is something we can definitely lean into. There's another concept along with reverse mentorship and multiple mentorship called needs-based sponsorship, and it's the needs-based. So let me just write that down because I don't know if that's coming across clearly right now. But it's the idea that we provide sponsorship not only to people who ask for it, but people who need it based on the disaggregated data. So disaggregated data is the idea that we collect data across intersectional identities, and when we see gaps there, then we create a program that intentionally offers them the support that they need without, saying this person is asking for it. And the reason I say this is because of this slide right here. In some cultures, it is acceptable to ask others for help, while in others, it isn't. We can be equitable by offering opportunities to people through structured programs where everyone has a chance to sign up without judgment, right? So culturally, not all of us perhaps feel like we're in a position to ask for support. So we want to make sure that we offer that to people through equity. Okay, so now we're going to get into the developing actual programs. And I've created a table or a circle here, and you'll see I use circles a lot because I don't think that this work is linear. It's very often through a feedback loop. There's 3 stages to developing this program. The first one is the planning, right? And this is where we can do some organizational bias training, some brainstorming, and some identifying of stakeholders. Because for this to come to life, this mentorship sponsorship program, we need to know who needs to be involved for this to happen, right? And we need to do some foundational level setting too. The next part is execution. And it's the idea that, this is how we bring it to life. We create application forms, we pair people, and perhaps we set up monthly meetings. That's an example. And finally, we have evaluation, which is a monthly report, anonymous feedback, and incorporating promotional reviews, right? So we don't just want this to happen. We want to see how this is translating to actual promotions and moving up within an organization or moving around in an organization, whatever people want, right? And what I've done here is create a table for you that is something that we can use to pitch to stakeholders. This roles and responsibilities matrix is really essential to bringing DEI work to life. The more clear people are on what is expected of them, the more likely they are to do it. So I've listed out group 1, 2, 3, and 4, and who does what by when. And what I've done on the next slide is to fill it in with examples. So over here, you'll see, so I have 4 boxes: individual contributors, people managers, leadership team, executive board, and at the bottom, there's a line and an arrow that says increased responsibility, right? And as you can see from the size of the text within the box, even if you're not reading it in detail, you can see that there's more responsibility on the leadership team than there is on people managers, than there is on individual contributors. And what we're going to do in our breakout rooms is find an incentive or a practice or a pitch that can actually appeal to leadership so that they do this work, right? And they're on board with this. But you can see here some examples that I put together. I tried to make them as specific as possible. So for example, all of them are required to participate in organizational bias training by, for example, Q2, Q3, Q1, and then you have different optionalities for different groups. For individual contributors, voluntary signing up for the program, provide anonymous feedback. And as you go on, you see how the responsibility of leadership is more so, for example, presenting a vision of this work at a 2023 town hall, offering a 1-hour office hours to answer questions. So these are all practices that we can put into a matrix or a table that will give an organization a clear vision of how something like this would come to life. The two pieces that are missing from this, because I couldn't fit it onto the slide, is statistics that show the value of mentorship and sponsorship programs. And I'm going to read out a couple to you. Studies show that 25% of employees enrolled in mentorship programs have a salary grade change. Mentees get promoted 5 times more often than people without mentors. And mentors, and this is a really important one, mentors get promoted 6 times more often than people without mentees. So these statistics show that people benefit, whether you're a mentee or a mentor. Both benefit. Everybody benefits. In fact, the whole organization benefits. So that piece is missing, is the statistics. And the other piece that's missing from here is budget and resources, right? Because if we're going to do this, we want to allocate resources. And a good example of resources are time, right? If we're filling in every minute within our workplaces with do this, do that, do this, do that, we're not going to have time to do this. So we need a conscious, intentional commitment to say 4 hours a month are going to be spent on pursuing mentorship and sponsorship opportunities. Okay. I will share the resource for this. I apologize. I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, but I will look through it as we get into our breakout rooms, which we are going to do now. But first, Shanta, you wanted to ask your question?
Yeah, I think I kind of had the answer. It was in regards to the reverse mentorship piece. My question was about exactly what are you teaching? So when Jen talked about, transgender folks teaching cisgender folks and how that could be dangerous, I guess my question was, are we saying that they would be teaching about their experiences? I was just trying to understand what was the teaching exactly, because when I looked at it, I didn't think that it would be, that, because my assumption was that it could be teaching about, many things related to their work in the DEI space, so I just wanted to get clarity on what the expectation was for teaching when it's a reverse mentorship relationship.
Yeah, well, taking the word mentorship, which means giving advice, it's less teaching and more advising people on perhaps how to show up more inclusively or whatever it may be, right? Whatever somebody may be looking for advice about. But I also think that we need to create an approach of understanding where harm comes in all of this. And so reverse mentorship itself is a concept that we need to we need to make more sense of it. We can't just put it out there and say, this is the concept that we think we should have in an organization. What does that look like? Like, what are the actual parameters to a program like this? What are the expectations of people? Who is it centering and who is benefiting from this? So I think it's more like, let's have some questions around that and formulate it. And maybe at the center of it is sharing of experiences, perspectives, instead of teaching each other. That's the direction I would suggest going in. Okay, so we are at our exercise, and so again, our workshop is Ernst & Young, and I wanted to pause and say I've been pulling in some examples here of kind of the same kind of organizations, so I would love, as you look through the, what's upcoming, if you have an example of an organization that's doing something well, please share it with me, and I'll try my best to build it into our our breakout rooms so that we're not consciously looking at the same. And I'm going to try to challenge myself to look at different ones as well. But here we go. Ernst & Young, along with a couple other organizations, have been recognized for a particular sponsorship program. In this case, it's called the Inclusive Leadership Program, where they're pairing high potential performers with executive board members. Not perfect, because the word high performance is very subjective. So there's definitely room for improvement here. And I think this workshop and case study is incomplete unless we look at who actually is in leadership. So I wanted to give that caveat right there. In your breakout room, so we're going to do 10 breakout rooms again, I'd love for you all to come up with one way to pitch a career pathways program to leadership. And for those of you who are thinking about the reverse mentorship piece, perhaps this is a great example for a discussion around that. What can we do to create, maybe pitch a reverse mentorship program to leaders, and what do we need to be conscious of? So I'm going to put you in these breakout rooms. We're going to come back in about 10 to 12 minutes. And in the meantime, I'll catch up with the chat and make sure I follow up with anything there. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had some productive conversations. I have dropped in the link to where I got the statistics about mentors and mentees, but there is another article that I wanted to share with you here, and it refers to a term called mini-me prodigies, and it was, I think, first written by Bloomberg with statistics that show how many people invest in people that are the same race and gender as them, and how this can hurt people who are underserved because of how, what percentage representation they have in leadership. So specifically, if we look at Black women, I believe the percentage is 4% in leadership. Perhaps it's less. I will check that statistic, but the mini-me prodigy concept is, okay, if the remaining is not Black, imagine who they're investing in. So definitely look up the term mini-me prodigies, and the article that I shared is the one that details that the most. Okay, so I'd love to hear from you all. What is one way that you can think about pitching an idea of a mentorship, sponsorship, coaching program to leaders? Anybody want to go first?
Yo, we'll go first. We were group 7. Group 7 was the best. I'm just gonna say, y'all. Just gonna let you know, my folks in there were ride or die. I just said that this. Can you go back to the question?
Yeah, it's up there. Do you see
it? Okay. So the problem with this is that it just needs to be imploded. This, the way it is just white people for white people. This has nothing to do with people of color. Like, to pitch a career pathways without centering the marginalized groups, because the reality is it's going to be 90. If we're talking about who are in these positions, who are high achieving, there's going to be very few people from marginalized backgrounds. If this is truly for people with marginalized backgrounds to go up, this thing needs to be imploded and more intentful with the language and what we're really trying to do with it.
Okay, thank you for sharing, Jen. Do others feel that way in the same group? Naima, I don't know if you were in the same groups, but I want to give you the opportunity to share.
No, I wasn't in the same group.
Okay.
Like, to agree or to, sorry, what was the
No, I was going to see if there was anybody else, but what I would like to do so that we hear from everyone is, in the chat, please feel free to respond to what Jen said about how we can pitch this question better so that it centers people that are underserved, because I think that's a really important piece, that if we're going to see the value of sponsorship and mentorship, how do we do it in a way that centers the groups that are most marginalized?
Yeah. Can I go?
Naima, you had your hand up first. Did you want to go first, and then Celia, and then Jimena?
I was just going to respond in regards to our group and what we came up with.
Sure. Go ahead, and I'm monitoring the chat as well.
So I was in group 2, and from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint in regards to organizations that are looking to not only find diverse candidates, but hire diverse candidates and keep diverse candidates, I think from being able, from a retention standpoint, I think that we could pitch the idea of attrition planning as a business case for not only retention, but creating an internal pipeline, being able to save money because folks are staying opposed to leaving after you've invested in onboarding, training, and so forth. Also being able to create opportunities to identify based off of individual strengths and weaknesses, helping put people in positions that are best for them based off of their strengths. And then also from a branding standpoint, for recruitment, right? So for organizations that are looking to be able to highlight some of the positive things that they're doing within their organization, using a mentor or sponsorship program as a selling tool, so to speak, in regards to retention, like that might be a benefit. Beyond group 2, let me know if I left something out.
business case around nutrition. That's great. Yeah, like what is it costing the organization when people are leaving because we're not developing pathways for people that are underserved. So thank you for that. Okay, I see a couple comments in the chat. I agree with Jen. So it definitely looks like this question needs to be reframed, which is an important piece. You know, when we do this work, how do we even ask the question in a way that centers the groups that we're supposed to be serving? So that's something that I will definitely add in our best practice, and I'll make sure that the question is something that we're even equipped to answer in an equitable way. Celia, you had your hand up?
Yes. So I was in the group with Carnisha, Sipa, and Guadalupe, and I don't remember what the number was. So for us, I think the conversation, just kind of unpacking the question itself, is first of all, who defines what productivity, and like what is that high performing? So who defines the productivity and what does that look like? And so just kind of sticking with the theme of Ernst & Young, this is a corporate business, money-minded, dollar figure, important kind of scenario that we're looking at. So is it the number of files that we open, the number of dollar figures and clients that we bring in? What exactly is it? What is it that we're looking at? So if we were to make it more inclusive, it's first of all defining what productivity means for each and every single area. So whether it's someone who is on the front end of customer service, or back end, even back or the back office where they're kind of doing all the business and closing the cases and etc. So there needs to be a good understanding of what is considered as being productive, and not exactly just being focused on the number of hours spent. The other thing that we talked about was the possibility of connecting the whole notion of what this mentorship is going to look like, or the productivity is going to look like, is that it's connected with the value of the organization, and the fact that there is the social and ethical responsibilities that organizations have, and they tend to throw those big names and big words as values. So to me, it's like if they're saying, yes, we value diversity and we value human dignity, et cetera, and that's what you really bring into the design of the program, to say that our program or mentorship program is actually going to support the value that the organization is listing in terms of diversity and inclusion. So now that we have defined what productivity looks like, so it goes beyond just the number figure, the dollar figure, so that it's not only connected to high performance, because and I kind of joked about it, and I'm sorry if there is someone who defines that way, but I was thinking that the high performing person in my mind looks like a white male in their probably mid to late 40s, possibly divorced, and who does not have to take care of kids. So they've got all the time in the world to do whatever it is that they want to do, and they can certainly close those things sooner and faster than anyone else. So that was the thing. And Guadalupe had a comment around sustainability, which I thought was fantastic. And I want, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was just mentioning, this is kind of nerve-wracking to talk to everybody at the same time, but something I thought about was just sustainability and kind of the patterns, right? What kind of people are coming back to the same mentorship? But we're seeing that the same dominant group is coming back, right? Then maybe it's not working. And being able to present the patterns of how realistic and how sustainable the program really is, I think it's something that's really important to look at the patterns of people coming back.
Thank you. So it looks like there's two things we really need to do here. And one is reframe this question so that it centers underserved groups, but also define what productivity is, right? Because there's a tendency here, even through the question and the case study, to assume that Ernst & Young has got the program right and the people that we need support from are leaders, when quite truthfully, the leaders need support from us and I use the term us to say, DEI practitioners. So that's what I meant by that. Okay, we have 3 more hands up, and I want to give time to Q&A. So Monica, Devin, and Veronica, do you mind sharing your thoughts quickly, maybe at a minute each if possible, so that I can share the assignment and then open up to Q&A? Go ahead. Monica, go ahead. You're first.
Okay, thanks. So I was in a group with Jillery, Tima, and Andre, and Jillery had a lot of really great tangible examples from her experience. The biggest pitch to leadership, I think, would be the cost saving around attrition and retention that we talked about. Also, engagement, disengaged employees are a cost to organizations as well. So, engagement, and one thing that Julie brought up that I think is really important to add here is creating mentorship or sponsorship programs for people that don't necessarily want to climb but are really happy with where they are and just want to expand as an individual contributor and grow, where they are. Just to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Again, we're seeing, this point that we need to redefine what the purpose of this is. Is it to climb into a position that's continuously harmful to people that are underserved, or is it to really center this group? So I'm seeing 3 points here, and I think that's essential in figuring out how this comes to life. Devin?
Awesome. So I was in a group with Dr. Nate, Nick, and McKenna, and I think a couple things we talked about as a pitch would be like a cohort model. And so if there's a cohort model that has like a clear career pathway with the individual guiding the process. So the example I gave is, if you're at entry level and you're interested in being the VP of finance at some point, right? Like being intentional about making sure you're paired with somebody in the finance department. And then something else we talked about, which definitely needs some massaging, but if there were case studies and assignments that were created to actually solve organizational problems, right? And so if there was something that was going on in the finance or in learning and development, and one of your stretch projects or goals was to support solving this issue, and there was some recognition or compensation that came with that, I think that'd be a really good idea. That was kind of proposed in our group to figure out how mentorship can be a value add to the organization and also to the individual. And then the last thing was just having the folks who graduate from that cohort then enter into the mentoring space to kind of teach or mentor the next group of folks who are coming in, whether it be selection or application process.
That's great. Thank you. Veronica?
I love all of that. I just want to take like 10 seconds of my 1 minute to just say that. At AARP, which is where I work, we used to have something called I6, which is all around innovation. And there were people who were selected to participate in things like that. So, like, the more equitable we can make opportunities like that, I think fantastic, amazing. I was in group 10 with Jeffrey, Fatima, and Desiree, and we talked about how this discussion builds on the assignment that we had around the scalability for the two. You have 2 employees, one gets promoted, the other one doesn't. How can we create programs that amplify and give people that visibility across the board? And how this really focuses on, like, if we're able to focus on leaders of people, like building on that. And so we talked about how do we figure out adding or turning up the dial a little bit on the accountability piece. So when we looked at that screenshot, absolutely awesome that it has involvement in bias training at all levels, but feel like there could be a way to add incentive or performance to attach that or align that to the progress that's being made at every level. So how can we figure that out? And then also communications planning so that it does feel accessible to all employees, but also amplifying it by leveraging ERGs and ERG's leadership so that it's reaching folks who do identify as that underserved community and who really can benefit and help us to achieve equity that way. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anything. I know I only had 1 minute and I think I took up 2. But that was sort of right.
This is great. Thank you, Veronica, for sharing as we go into the last couple slides and then our Q&A. The incentive piece is really important, and I think that we need also a piece that's not just providing incentives, but the opposite too, right? Like what happens when somebody does not participate in these programs when they have the access and they're gatekeeping. So that's something I'm trying to figure out how we can make sure we implement in these plans, which brings us to our assignment. So here, develop the seeds of a long-term mentorship or sponsorship program between lower level and higher level employees. Answer the following questions. What is one incentive for employees at lower levels to participate? What is one incentive for employees at higher levels to participate? And then fill in the above template. The template is, it's got 5 columns, and each column asks you to fill in something that's practical. So it could be like resources, time, something that really puts this into something that is a system. And I encourage you to challenge it, right? If you think that there's something that can be improved about the template, please do share that in your assignment, and we can review it in our next class, because we want all of our classes to build on what we've been doing instead of just going forward and saying, all right, checkbox, we're done mentorship, sponsorship. It sounds like we need to do some rethinking around this model in particular, especially because it's so impactful if it's done right. So that brings us to Q&A. I have a couple minutes, and please, Nina, I see your hand up. So did you want to start?
Sure. What are some really good examples of sponsorship that you've seen
within organizations?
Or organizations, or just anything?
Yeah, a good example of sponsorship that I've seen is actually within quite a few DEI communities of practice. So ones where people perhaps have stepped into a consulting role or a coaching role, and they are being approached with a lot of opportunities, and they bring somebody on that can benefit from that or share those opportunities with others. I've definitely seen an informal practice of that among different DEI councils and communities. I haven't seen a formal one come up yet. I've seen formal mentorship programs where you go to a place within the intranet or whatever the internal program is. You sign your name, you click off a couple boxes of what you're looking for, and then they pair you with somebody for maybe 3 to 4 sessions. But it's one-way directional, and it's definitely got room for improvement, because as we look at the representation in leadership, even when we have these programs, if the numbers and the dynamics, identities don't shift, then something about this needs to be tweaked. Perhaps the whole thing needs to be, as Jen said, imploded and then redesigned from the margins into a scalable way. So that's what I've seen. I've definitely seen a lot more talk about it, and I've seen a lot more people making this their work in 2022, because there's been studies that have come out and said this is the missing piece to representation and leadership. Andre.
Yeah, so last week I had a discussion on how they centered their retention and advancement within mentorship. And when I raised sponsorship within this organization, they had said that they are not there yet. Now I know that we've had this discussion about the two. Why would someone say? Why would an organizational leader say that they're not at that stage yet? And that's something that I kind of found not necessarily disheartening, but I found it a little bit odd for a leader to say that, given that we're trying to sponsor talent to move ahead and to advance in the organization, etc. So that's something that I was grappling with.
Yeah, I think 2 reasons come to mind, probably more the second one, but the first reason, maybe they don't understand what sponsorship really is. They may think that sponsorship follows mentorship, but it's not a straight line. It's not one comes after the other. It's actually one can be a replacement for mentorship. But more likely, the second is unwillingness to share those resources. That very often happens within organizations where the term sponsorship may imply to leaders who want to gatekeep, to say, no, this is something that we want to continue, that inner circle of circulating the job opportunities, circulating, stretch projects, and that needs to be challenged. So I would start with an education piece, and then I would definitely start with the point that one doesn't follow the other, and there's no better time to start sponsorship than now. And then to some points that some of the wider group shared, which is tie this to attrition and engagement and the cost of that, right? The more we bring that in, a lot of leaders in organizations talk the talk of money. And so when you talk to them like that, like there's $1 trillion, I think an article came out recently that loss of people from the Great Resignation has led to $1 trillion. And it's $1 trillion in losses. So when you hear that number, okay, we got to do something.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. Tahira?
Hi. So I had a question. The COO at my agency, through some crazy events that went down, became my mentor. And over the years, she has taken on also a role of sponsoring me, mentioning my name in boardrooms and things like that in order to help advance my career. But I want to know, can a mentor and a sponsor be one and the same, or is that someone who can start off as a mentor and become a sponsor, or should those roles be separate?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people in the chat, because we got, when we did that poll, a lot of people did say they had mentors and sponsors. I absolutely think that one can be both. I actually would have that expectation as we do more and more mentorship and sponsorship work, that the entire role of a mentor should involve some degree of sponsorship. So I do think the two should be working in tandem. Hopefully we'll get to a place where it'll be a role that somebody understands is more than just giving advice to someone, but making sure that they share their names and their opportunities in rooms that they don't have access to. Tracy?
Yes. So I wanted to make a note, because I've been in a couple of leadership programs, and sponsorship has never come to what you have listed to me before. So I think that there is a lot of education that needs to be had on what sponsorship looks like. A lot of the places where I've gone, sponsorship has always been tied to some type of financial obligation, whether it meant putting you in some type of executive coaching program or a business leadership program. It's always been tied to something where it was some financial something that was being put out there. So the fact that you've put that, I feel as though that there is definitely, it's more of an educational piece, and it may even be, since this is more of a global class with people being from all over. And I don't know if it's something that is strictly within the United States, or if it's, I think that there's a lot of gray for everybody to really kind of get the real understanding, and corporations to understand that. I like what you say for sponsorship, because I think that there are a lot of people who do that already, but not knowing that it's actually called sponsorship and mentorship, and like not one and the same, but two different things, but the way that you show up for people.
Yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be more education around what sponsorship actually is, some more challenging of it, some more even redefining of it, right? The way it is right now, it's been put out as a concept, but we have an opportunity, and by we, I mean all of us within workplaces, to really craft something that is meaningful and impactful in terms of representation. This is the opportunity to do it. So maybe we can begin by having the conversation and then revisiting this after we continue to do our other classes, to see what is it, that sponsorship actually looks like in practice. Okay, well, thank you everybody for sharing. A couple resources. So, understanding the impact of mentorship versus sponsorship is an article that I've linked to. And then this is actually a tweet that I wrote, 5 ways you can sponsor others. It's very practical ways. You'll see it's just listed out 5, but it was circulated quite a bit, including, sharing people's LinkedIn, their title, it's just 5 examples there, but very in real life practices. And then I saw in the chat that a TED Talk was shared too. So I would love to, have that shared on the Discord channel so that people can learn more about that. For next class, how to show white men that diversity and inclusion efforts need them. This is an article that we are going to talk about in our next class when we discuss stakeholders. And that is it for today. Thank you everybody for your participation and your great ideas. I'm going to build them into the next deck, and let's just continue challenging each other.